Hey everybody, welcome back to the Half Naked Quilter. My name is Clay and this is Season 1, Episode 4. Now in the previous episode, in the previous lesson, we talked about how to use the cutting mat and the rulers and the rotary cutter to cut pieces of fabric off of that gigantic yardage that you're going to buy at the store. And we ended up with enough squares to make 7 blocks. Today what we're going to do is talk about how to put those blocks together Today we're going to talk about how to put those squares together into a 9-patch block. Like I said, really simple, very, very straightforward. Remember, this is where we're going, right? And we've got our stack of squares that we did. This is a little bit messy, sorry about that. This part of the sewing is really straightforward. Nearly everything we do in the quilting world is straight seams, so it's not a lot of fancy going on. The big idea for this episode is a process called seam locking. Now, seam locking is how we get 4 squares or 4 rectangles or 4 blocks as we're putting together the quilt to all match up at one point. Some quilters, my mother was one of them, my best friend is another, are incredibly OCD about making sure they're exactly right. I'm like, yeah, if it's close enough, I'm not gonna worry about it. But I'm gonna show you this thing called seam locking, which is a technique that quilters use to very, very easily get those things to line up. Now let's look at the table real quick. Remember, we've got 9 blocks. We're gonna sew them together in 3 rows. So there's 1, there's 2, and there's 3, right? Okay, in order to get these corners to line up, right? This little corner here, we're going to do a trick that starts at the ironing board and iron the seam allowances in opposite directions, and it gives us a way to actually match that up really, really tightly. I'm going to go that into more detail after we finish sewing and ironing. We come back to the cutting table to get things ready to sew the strips into the actual block, and you'll see specifically how that works. But that gives you a preview of where this is going. Let me do a quick demonstration so you kind of have a visual on where this is going. So in seam locking, what we're doing is we're taking advantage of the fact that we've ironed those seam allowances to one side to help us get this corner lined up. Now the trick here is if you look at the seam, these seam allowances are ironed to the left, and you can just barely see it, but you can definitely feel it as you run your finger across. There's a little bump up. So whichever side the seam allowances have been ironed to will be a little bit elevated right at that seam. The trick is if we put those on opposite sides, so the bump here is on the left, the bump here is on the right, we can use those 2 bumps and snug them up against each other to get those 2 exactly lined up with each other. So the way we're going to take advantage of this is we're going to lay the top piece down a little to the left of where the bump is, and we're going to put our finger just gently on the top, slide over until we feel it go thunk and drop into that crevice. You can actually feel it, it's pretty pronounced. Let's try that again. So we just drag across until you feel it go thunk and drop into the crevice. The first time you do this, you'll get it. Let me do it lined up at the top the way you do it for a block. Thunk, all right. Hopefully you can see this, but you see how tightly aligned those 2 edges are now. So if you look inside, they're right on top of each other. So if you sew this, you're going to get something that matches up perfectly just the way it does here in this block. Now the reality is we're going to do that seam locking from multiple directions, but the trick is for all of them is just making sure you feel that go bump and fall down into that crevice. Then you know it's aligned. Here's a note for the experienced sewers that are with us today. If you're a beginning sewer, you can pretty much ignore this. If you're an experienced sewer, the next couple of things we're going to do are probably things you can already do. You don't have to listen to me babble my way through this unless you really want to. In which case we're going to worry about your sanity, but that's another thing. What we're going to do is talk about the basic cleaning steps that you should do when you start a new project, and then we're going to sew these blocks together into the 3 strips. We're going to do ironing a little bit later. but we're going to sew the blocks into these 3 strips. So if you can already do this, don't worry about watching me do this at the sewing machine, because this is really, really straightforward. What you can do is fast forward to the first time you see us standing at the iron, because that'll be the next step after we're at the sewing machine, putting these together. This will save you a little bit of time. Now, I will say for the experienced sewers, there's one thing you need to know that works differently in the quilting world. And that's, when you start sewing a seam on a garment or something, you go forward, backward, forward at the end, right? We lock that stitch. In the quilting world, we hardly ever do that. And the reason why is, if you're sewing a seam, let's say where these 2 blocks are sewn together, and that's going to be crossed as it's sewn together with something above it, that crossing stitch will secure the one you did. So you don't need to go to the trouble of doing that back and forth thing on both ends. In fact, about the only time that we'll actually do it in quilting is when we're piecing the whole thing together and we're doing the last few things around the outside edge. Those seams aren't going to get crossed by anything because they're on the outside edge, right? So those we have to lock. But aside from that, don't worry about locking. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to start sewing just off of the fabric. So put the fabric under the presser foot, not on the fabric, but a little bit before it. So into the fabric all the way across, and then go past it a little bit. Those threads tangling up on both sides are enough to secure things until you go to the next step and sew something across the top of it. Trim your threads to about 1 inch. Anything less than that, they might come undone and things might get a little bit loose as you're handling things. Anything more, and you might see a shadow of a thread show up when you put the quilt together. So the idea here is, don't worry about stitch locking. Start a little bit off, sew on the seam, and then go off the other side a little bit. Then trim your threads to 1 inch. That's the only thing that's different about what I'm about to do. So those of you that experience sewers, if you want to not have to listen to me babble, forward until you see an iron. Okay, so beginning sewers, what you're going to do is go to your pile of squares. Remember, we put these together in sets. Grab 2 of them. So you've got one that has 4 white ones and 4 dark ones, and another one that has 4 light ones and 5 dark ones and 5 dark ones. You can set the others aside. We're only going to take these over to the sewing machine. So next step, we're going to sew. All right, so we're sitting here at the machine, starting a new project, and I think I mentioned this early on, one of the earlier episodes. The first thing I always do when I'm starting a new project is a little bit of routine maintenance. Doing this routine maintenance will prolong the life of your machine. It'll also keep it happier and it won't rattle as much. So what we're going to do here first is pop off the presser foot, remove the needle and discard it. Remember, we're going to use a fresh needle for every project because they get dull really, really fast. Pop off the throat plate and then remove your bobbin. Now you may have a top-loading bobbin. I wish these Berninas did. Mine I have to reach underneath and it's got a little bobbin case thing going on. Alrighty. Next thing you're going to do is grab that canned air that I had you buy. So it looks something like this. Put the straw into the nozzle and use that air to blow all of the lint out of machinery. Cotton fabrics throw a ton of lint. In fact, if you're doing a big project like a queen or a king size quilt, you'll probably end up having to stop and do this halfway through. Alrighty. So the next step before we button everything back up again is most machines have you do a little bit of oil into the bobbin area. So follow your manufacturer's instructions about how they want you to do that. Your machine will have come with a little vial of oil like this if it does. In my case is I got to put it in right here. So a little drop of oil. And then go ahead and run the machine a little bit just to work that oil into the mechanics. Alrighty, now we're going to start putting everything back together again. So pop the throat plate back on. There we go. Grab a fresh needle and go ahead and put that in. I'm working a little blind here because this is such a tight area. There we go. So fresh needle. Put the presser foot back on. There we go. At this point now, you're going to go ahead and wind the bobbins you're going to use for the project. For our purposes for all of this practice, go ahead and wind 2. But I had you get a half dozen because on most projects, you're gonna wind probably 4 or 5 right now. If you're doing a queen or a king size, you'll likely need more than that. But one of the most frustrating things in the world is to get partway through a project and have to stop and wind bobbins. Ugh. So go ahead and wind yourself 2 bobbins. And drop the bobbin back into the machine. In my case, I have to put it into this little holder thingy and then reach under here and figure out how to get my giant fingers to there it goes. All right. Now all you have to do is thread your machine and you're ready to go. Okay, quick note about stitch length. There's lots of ways to think about it. My rule of thumb is the smaller the piece of fabric that I'm sewing, the shorter that stitch length needs to be. For most purposes, a stitch length of 3, which is 3 millimeters on most machines, is going to do you just fine for most projects. When I get to putting big strips together on a big quilt and putting the borders, which is the outside edges on quilts, I'll sometimes go to 3.5 only because the process goes a little faster. But 3.0 will suit you pretty well for most routine quilt sewing. I wouldn't go any smaller than that because on these quilt cottons, shorter stitches make the fabric tighten and bunch up, and then you have a problem getting it to go flat again. So that is the routine maintenance that we're going to do before we start any project. All right, so we're sitting here at the sewing machine and we have done the routine cleaning. We brought with us 2 sets of squares to do 2 blocks, so we're going to put one aside. And remember, these go together dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. So let's go ahead and put these together in sets. So this is our first row. So it'll be dark, light, dark. Second row is light, dark, light. That'll be the second row. And then last one goes back to what the first one was. Dark, light, dark. So we're going to sew them in this order. So I'm going to set 2 of these aside. We'll start with the top strip. And this is just straight sewing. This is nothing unusual. This is nothing strange. You're going to align the corner and the top edge of those 2 squares. Get it lined up all the way down. Pop it under the needle. Now, if you know somebody who sews, they probably talk to you about this back and forward thing we do at the begin of a seam and at the end. It locks the stitch, like when you're doing garment sewing. We hardly ever do that in the quilting world. And the reason why is as long as the seam that we're sewing is going to get crossed by another one, that'll secure it so you don't have to bother. What you will do is, you see how I've set that down a little bit forward of where the needle is. So we're not going to start on the fabric. We're going to start just off the fabric. And so all the way to the end, and we're going to go off the other end. So you see I went 3 or 4 stitches off the other end. I have the thread cutter on my machine, so that makes it easy. And you're going to trim these threads to about, let's see, my machine always wads up the first one, to about 1 inch. So just trim the threads to about 1 inch. So now we will open this up and we'll do the same thing. So line that up, start it a little bit off this end. So onto it, and then off the other side. Right, so I'll trim this the manual way so you can see. So we got about 1 inch there, and we got about 1 inch there. So that has the first tip. Like I said, this is simple. This one's not rocket science. Let's do the middle one. So this one goes light, dark, light. So line that up so the edges are even, right? Set it down just to the forward. So onto it, and then off of it. See why I keep a pair of snippy scissors on this side? Just, it's handy to have a set here. All right, we'll open that up. So the next one, see how that lines up? A little bit in front of the needle. Get it started. All the way and off the end. Turn that to about an inch. Turn that to about an inch. Oh, I missed it. There we go. So there's our second row. And let's do the third one, which looks just like the first one. Oop, bumped my camera. Sorry about that. Hope that didn't make it dizzy. All right, so we line that up all the way down, drop the needle, so onto it, and then past it. Trim your threads. Open that up. So the next one. And start off, sew onto it, and then sew off the edge. Trim your threads. There we go. So there's the bottom one. There's the middle one. And there's the top one. Super simple. Like I said, if you can sew a straight line, you can quilt. All right. Next thing we're going to do is I want you to do one of these by yourself. So leave that second set of squares on your sewing table. You'll come back to this when we finish up this block, because I'm going to have you do one of these on your own. So just leave that second set that you brought over here, leave it on your sewing table. And now we're going to go to the iron. Okay, here we are at the ironing board. We've got these sewn together in 3 strips, and now we just need to iron the seam allowances all to one side so that we can do the seam locking when we sew them together. Now, the nice thing about 9-patch is all of these strips, pardon me, are reversible. So it doesn't matter which way we iron the seam allowances, because we can just flip it around to get it going the way we need for the seam lock. That won't always be the case, and sometimes you have to pay attention to which direction you're ironing these. In this case, we don't have to worry about it. So I'm going to set 2 of them aside. So here's the back with the seam allowances. The iron, the iron can be your best friend. It can also be your worst enemy, because the danger here is if you get too aggressive ironing this, you're going to stretch it out of square. And the minute you hit that with steam, it's permanent. Steam makes changes permanent in natural fabrics like this. You'd try to have to wash it again and try to get it to go back to being square, which is a pain. Let me show you the best way to do this so that you don't stretch this thing out of square. So grab your iron. Now, when we're doing clothes, we have a tendency to start point first, right? But look what happens if you do that. The point hits that seam first, and what will happen is it will stretch that seam into a curve, because you're getting pressure on this stitch line in the center first. So what we're going to do in the quilting world is come at it from the side of the iron instead of the point. So that's a trick. So we're going to come at it from the side, lay the iron down. We never press with the iron. The iron's job is to provide a little bit of weight of its own plus the heat and the steam. So if you press, you're going to stretch this out of square. So I'm going to set the iron down, grab the other side, and just pull very gently. And then I'm going to hit that seam all at once. See how that happened? I hit it all at once, and that way it doesn't stretch it into a curve. We're going to keep going all the way to the other end. Now you notice I didn't use steam that time. Do the first pass without steam to make sure I got it right, and then do another light pass with the steam to set it. Because remember, steam makes things permanent in these fabrics. So we'll come back. The steam's going to be kind of noisy. There we go. So that one is now pressed, and it stayed nice and square. So let's come back and do the middle one. Again, for these, it doesn't matter which way we go because they're reversible, right? Same thing.
Going to come at it from the side, tugging very, very gently. Don't pull. Just tug very gently. One side, the other side. Come back, give it a pass with the steam. Now, eventually you'll get confident enough that you can do that all in one step. That's what I do. But for right now, I would do it in 2 steps just to make sure that it came out right. So there's that one. And, alrighty. Last one here. Set the iron down, no pressing. Pull gently. Grab that first seam, grab that second seam. Now, if you want to check your work, you can look on the other side and make sure that when you give it a light pull, there's not an extra fold here somewhere. Flip it back over. We're going to do the steam pass now. There we go. Not pressing at all, not being aggressive with it. And there we go. So we've got all 3 of these strips. Put them in the right order, Clay. Seam allowances pressed to one side. Now we can go over to the cutting table and I'll show you seam locking again. All right, so we've sewn the 3 strips together and we've ironed the seam allowances to one side. Now the nice thing about this particular layout, it doesn't matter which way you iron the seam allowances because the rows are flippable. They're the same left to right as they are right to left. So you can just iron them all to one side. So come back to the cutting table here. We're going to go back to, this is where you have to do the seam locking. So notice we've got all the seam allowances, and I've got them lined up here where the seam allowances are all going to the left, right? Yeah. Okay, I'm going to flip the middle one. Now, if there was something different about this, you would have to have paid attention to which end was which when you iron the seam allowances. The nice thing on an iron block is you don't have to. Okay, so remember that whole process where we use the bump on the side the seam allowances have been ironed to as a way to get that aligned. So I'm going to set this one aside and we'll do this one first. All right, so we've got the one piece with the seam allowances to the left. Remember, you can see that little bump that goes from the left down to the right, left down to the right. We'll take the piece we're going to sew to it with the seam allowances to the right, so that bump is on the right side. Remember, you put it down just to one side, slide it along until you feel it drop into that hole, right? So now let's go up to the top. So get the top edges aligned, same thing, and you have to do it blind this time because you can't see, but you'll be able to feel it. Like, so the first time you ever do this, your fingers will go, oh, I get this, we're fine, right? So slide, thunk, okay, that just dropped in. In the pinned version of this, then all you have to do is stick a pin right over that stitching. So stick a pin right on the stitching. Same thing on the other side now. So we'll take a little bit of a fold here. Slide, thunk. And I had to stretch it just a little bit to get there, but that's fine. Stick a pin. Now, we know when we sew this, that's gonna, those corners are gonna be aligned and that's gonna work. I'll show you with the sewing machine. There's a faster way to do this that most of us do now. As a beginner, if you wanna come to the table and on the cutting table, align them and stick a pin in them, go right ahead until you get comfortable with it. I mean, that's totally fine. When I'm doing the long strips, putting the final quilt together, I end up doing that myself because the distance between them is so great. I want to know that they're lined up before I start sewing. But there's a way to do this on the fly over at the sewing machine. And when we get over there, I'll show you. So we'll do one like this that's been pinned, and then we'll do another one where I'll show you how to do that seam locking on the fly at the machine. It's a lot faster. You end up a lot less time having to come to the cutting table and do a bunch of pinning. But again, as a beginner, don't feel bad about coming here and sticking a pin in it, because that way you'll get some experience sewing these things together, and then as you get more practice, you can start playing around with just aligning those seam locks on the fly, and you're off to the races. This is one of the things that makes the process go a little bit faster. All right, let's go back to the sewing machine. All right, so we've gone to the cutting table and we got the first 2 strips seam locked, right? And we did this version with the pinning. When we put the third one onto here, I'm going to show you how to do it on the fly. So same process as before, right? Make sure it's lined up. Get it under the needle. You're going to be a little bit forward so we can sew on and then sew off. Go ahead and get started. Okay, now here's the trick when you get to this pin. First off, make sure, because the underneath seam allowance is pointing away from you, you want to make sure it didn't get folded under. That's why I like these awls, because I can reach under there and just brush it to make sure that it's right. We're going to sew right up to that pin, pull it out at the last minute. There we go. Now we'll sew to the next pin. Same thing, double check. Oop, that pin's going nice. Make sure that that seam allowance got under there where it belongs. Get the end of it aligned. We're going to sew right up to the pin, pull it out at the last minute, and now off the end. There we go. Trim your threads. All right. Now, if everything worked the way it was supposed to, yep, look at that. Well, this one's a little bit off, but I'm not going to worry about it. Like I said, my best friend would tear that apart and redo it. I'm not going to. So there you go. Okay, sorry if this is a little jarring. As I was watching the footage, I realized I didn't explain this step of the process terribly well, so I'm doing it again, and I'm just going to paste it together. So we finished sewing the first two strips together using seam locking and with a pin to hold that seam lock in place until we got over to the sewing machine. Then as we sewed the seam, we just pulled the pin out just before it went under the presser foot. You never want to run a presser foot over a pin. A, it'll probably bend the pin, and B, it has a tendency to screw up the feed and you get uneven stitches. Okay, what I'm going to show you now is a way to do this seam locking on the fly sitting at the machine. This is definitely an advanced skill, so you beginners, you're not going to be doing this for a while. Continue to go to the cutting tables, do the seam locking at the table, stick the pin in right along the stitching to align it. Continue to do that until you get very confident. You advanced sewers, you'll probably jump to this pretty quickly. So let me show you how this works. It is seam locking exactly the way we've done it before. Now in this case, the bottom seam allowance is going down. The top seam allowance then has to go up, and so I have to actually slide going up to get the two to align. So I'll do it off center here so you can see it for the first time. So I'm sliding up. Boop. Fell in. Sorry about that. My foot pressed the pedal. So let's do it again from here, right where we're going to do it. So I'm sliding up. Bump. Fell right in. All right, I'm going to hold my finger there because that's what's going to keep this aligned while we get started. Align the top of the strip, get under the needle, start sewing just like you would normal, right? Now you can either continue to hold it with your finger or, and this is why I like having an awl, I can stick an awl right on that stitching line. And this acts like the pin. Now you're not pressing down really hard because it will scratch the tabletop. But I'm just holding it on here so it acts like a pin, right? So we keep going. In this case, we have to make sure that that seam allowance doesn't get folded over. There we go. So we've gone through the first one, right? So we know that that's locked. Sometimes I'll even drop the needle down. I have a thing on my my foot pedal where I can do that, just to anchor everything. Because now we need to align the second one. It's going to be in the same direction, so I got to push the bottom one up a little bit. And then slide, boom, until it falls in. Same deal. Now at this point, I didn't have to stop and realign the top, so I can go ahead and use that awl right now. So stitchy, 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 and through. Great. Now just align the bottom and off the edge. It's that simple. So let me trim this and you can see it. Where's the oh, there it is. My machine has a tendency to wad up the starting threads sometimes on the back. All right, so we've done the same thing here. We just did it on the fly, and you'll notice they are aligned. There's one, there's two. This is leftover thread from where I ripped it out to do it again. 1 and 2, all nice and aligned. So like I said, you can do this, random threads everywhere. You can do this, the version where you pin it at the cutting table. And again, beginners, that's what you're going to want to do for a while until you get really confident. Once you get some confidence, then you can come over here and just do this on the fly. It goes a lot faster, and particularly when you're doing 60,000 blocks, being able to align these on the fly will speed the process up quite a bit. There you go. Now, we're going to go back over to the ironing board and iron these seam allowances, and then we'll be done.
All right, so here's the block we've sewn together. The last thing we just have to do is iron these seam allowances. And honestly, at this point, for this block, it doesn't matter which way you do it. There are some nuances to which side you press seam allowances to in some designs because it adds a little bit of dimensionality. With 9-patch, we're not going to worry about it. And it doesn't matter which way we iron these because both of these sides are identical. So we're going to do the same thing. We're laying it face down. Grab your iron, set it down, give it a little tug. And notice I'm grabbing it in 2 places here so it's nice and even. I'm going to have to do this twice because this seam is so long. Like I said, we're not going to go point first. Come and grab this one. Oh, I got a long thread there I didn't trim. Now we can double check our work. See, there's no folds or puckers. So we're good. Come back for the steam pass. There we go. And then in finished blocks like this, I like to give the top a light steaming as well, just to set everything at the end. And get no pressure. This is just gliding over it. Let the weight of the iron and the steam do the job for you. There we go. That block is now done. I've got some long threads. There we go. That block is now done. All right. We got a block done. Now what I'm going to have you do is we've gone through this process together once. You've got a second set of squares. Do this all over again on your own, right? Sew them together in strips, take them to the irons, iron the seam allowances one direction. You can either seam lock them on the fly at the sewing machine or come over to your cutting table and pin them. Either one is completely fine right now, right? If you're not comfortable lining them up on the fly, come to the table, stick a pin in them, it's totally fine. When I'm putting the final rows together for a quilt, I use the pins because there's so much going on, I don't want to miss that I've got that aligned. So take that second set of squares, go to your sewing machine and your iron, sew them into the second block, and so what you'll have is 2 blocks. Now those blocks were created start to finish. And I think I said at the beginning of this episode, that's something we hardly ever do because we're having to make 3,000 of everything, right? So what I'm going to teach you in the next lesson is how to do something called chain piecing. In chain piecing, what we do is we turn this into a production process where we're going to do the same step of every block, one after the other. And then we'll cut them apart. In fact, we're not even trimming the threads between them. We just sew them all together in a big long chain. Cut them apart, do the next step for all of them. Boom, 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 right? It makes it very quick to plow through when you have to make, like the quilt I'm working on now has like 90 something blocks in it, right? If you did those 1Z, 2Z, 3Z, it would drive you nuts and take forever. So that's what we're going to do in the next episode. Congratulations, you sewn your first quilt block, and I will see you in the next episode.